When it comes to the colonial role that was imposed on the African continent, it can be summarized in three basic points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number two, we were supposed to be the place that consumes technology and industrial output from the global north. We still play that role today. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, technical assistance, all of that. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. That was the role we played during colonial times. And unfortunately, that is the role we continue to play today. So colonialism, of course, was not a system for development. It was not designed to achieve sustainable development goals or a just transition or justice or anything. Colonialism was a system of extraction, of abuse. We should not be surprised that the same colonial structures, economic colonial structures that persist today are producing these bad results of malnutrition, of poverty, of socioeconomic exclusion. So that's why in the context of the just transition and the context of decarbonization, we always say we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And when it comes to kind of the visible manifestation of these problems, the issue of external debt, that is debt denominated in foreign currencies, in dollars and euros. It is a serious problem because it takes a huge amount of fiscal policy space that doesn't allow our governments to invest in the building blocks of development and prosperity, such as basic health and education and infrastructure, because we have to prioritize paying the external debt. But external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that have colonial roots. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits. And I can explain each very briefly so we can understand why these are fundamental. When I say food deficits, according to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa today imports 85% of its food. 85%. When less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And what happened is that there's a redesign of the system as soon as we gained independence. In 1955, for example, in Europe, at the Treaty of Rome meeting, the Europeans said we have a food security problem for Europe because they were so dependent on Africa. And that introduced the common agricultural policy, which is in place to this day. So what is CAP? It's heavy agricultural subsidies to produce the core crops in Europe, such as corn and wheat and soybean and the core food security items. And of course, it wasn't just Europe that did that. It was the United States, Canada, Australia, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and Ukraine today dominate the grain industry. And what it did is that it forced African farmers out of business because they couldn't compete with the subsidized wheat and corn coming from the global north. So we had to redesign our agriculture to specialize in cash crops for exports. Coffee, tea, tobacco, bananas, all the complementary items. So today we live in a world where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume. And that's why we have real food insecurity on the African continent and the rest of the global south, obviously. So that's the food deficiency. Number two, energy deficiency. When I say energy deficits in Africa, I include our biggest oil exporter on the continent. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline, not by accident, by design. Angola, our second largest oil exporter, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. So we're constantly denied the technology for processing, the technology for drilling, the technology for refining. So we export crude oil, we import refined petrochemicals. You export the cheap stuff, you import the more expensive stuff. So you're always in a deficit situation. And finally, the manufacturing deficits, the fact that the only type of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with the value-added content of what we export is low value added, what we import is high value added. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports. You're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. And here's how it's manifest then. You have these structural deficits, the most fundamental areas. As you know, no country can function without food, without fuel, without manufacturing. So we have structural trade deficits. And what structural trade deficits do is that they weaken our currencies relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything I need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, you import it at a higher price. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy, therefore hurting the most vulnerable people in society. And that immediately forces our governments into a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, which makes sense to protect the most vulnerable, but you can't do that for 8 decades. And we ask our central banks to stabilize the exchange rate, to fight inflation. And the way they do it is by using a band-aid solution, which is borrowing more dollars. And that gets the external debt into a vicious cycle that is unsustainable, which means now the government is completely obsessed with prioritizing economic activity that will allow us to earn dollars as quickly as possible so that we service the debt. And we deprioritize economic activity that is actually transformational, that is actually the foundation of development and prosperity. And that is the essence of why we neglect so many of the priorities. And that's why a lot of the fiscal policy space that our governments have is dedicated to servicing the debt, which is by design the colonial architecture that was imposed on us. So that's why we say we can't really achieve the sustainable development goals or a just transition or any of the goals that we want to achieve under a system, an economic system that's still structurally colonized when we have economies that are technically steered from abroad.